You'd be hard-pushed to find a more familiar image from the ancient world than the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis in Athens. In our heads, this has come to represent so many things. Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, the human quest for beauty, the quest for the gods. And it's certainly true that the place that spawned it, 5th century Athens, did generate many of the ingredients that we think is now essential for civilization. This is where demos kratia, democracy, was born. It's where we get classical lines in architecture, science and philosophy and drama are all nurtured, and it's where we find the foundations of our own legal system. Of course, even the word political comes from the Greek for city-state, polis. There's no doubt that 5th century Athens was the most extraordinarily radical place. For the first time in recorded history, I, the people, hoi polloi, acted as a political agent. So in the Athenian assembly, you get pastry sellers next to aristocrats, shoemakers sitting next to generals, and all of them voting how to run their own lives. It's no surprise, really, that the influence and the example of Athens has echoed down the centuries. But what we mustn't do is rush to embrace it as a model for all perfect societies. As well as the beautiful art and the very high-minded public works that we're more familiar with, the Athenians and the Assembly also voted year in, year out to go to war. They enslaved huge numbers of the population in the Eastern Mediterranean. In Golden Age Athens, Athenian citizens were outnumbered 2 to 1, possibly even 3 to 1 by slaves. And I think I'd have had a pretty unsatisfying time there. As a woman, I would have had civic and religious duties, but I wouldn't have been allowed to vote in the assembly. I might well have been veiled. I'd have been discouraged from speaking out in public, and my name wouldn't even be spoken.
Don't forget the dark underside of the democratic achievement.
Most slaves began their lives as free men and women, but were forced into a life of manual labour when they became prisoners of war. They were bought and sold, separated from their families, sterilised so as not to breed. It wasn't only slaves. In fact, 9/10 of the population were barred from voting. There was an age restriction. And it wasn't enough to be born in Athens. Both your father and your mother had to be born there too. And of the remaining free Athenians, half, like me, were automatically disqualified. Women weren't just unequal, they were believed to be demonic, possessed by daimones, spirits. They needed to be controlled, visibly restricted. In fact, the first hard evidence of the full face veil comes from Athens.
Women were not meant to be seen. All the evidence of vase painting would suggest that the woman is veiled. She has her cloak draped over her head.
Should we ever have a go?
Sue Blundell is researching the status of women in Athenian society.
And just drape it over your arm like that. Then if you want to cover your face, you can go like that.
Yes.
Lovely.
Well, look, I match. Sophocles said, silence is the greatest ornament of the woman. I feel nicely silent like that. I hate it. It makes me feel really claustrophobic. The message that's being sent out is that a married woman is the possession of the man.
Yes, he is the one person in her life for whom she will unveil herself, yes.
It wasn't only Athens. Almost every society till the 20th century has been fiercely patriarchal. But there was, in that searing mass of experimentation, the possibility that something different could have been done. Where do we hear about that? We hear about it as a joke. Aristophanes imagines what would happen if women took over. We hear about it as philosophical thought. So Plato imagines what happens if we got rid of the family and had women as well as men as guardians of his republic.
But of course it didn't happen. Only the free men of Athens could belong to the Democratic Club, which met together on the Pnyx.
At dawn, Athenian citizens would come here to sit around on the bare rock and debate in the assembly how it was that they should run their own lives.
So we're going to do an experiment in Greek democracy. So who's for?
The purpose of life for an ordinary human being in Athens was political life.
And who's against?
It's absolutely unparalleled in world history.
So the motion's carried.
Mogens Hansen is a world authority on Athenian democracy and how it works in practice.
This is where the people meet to pass their laws, to pass their decrees, to elect their prime minister, and they all do it by show of hands. That's the voice of the people. The Athenians believed the name Pnyx was derived from the adjective pyknos, which means crowded or densely packed. The Pnyx covers 2,400 square meters. A person takes up 0.4 square meters if he sits down. Thus, it could accommodate 6,000 citizens.
Important legislation needed to be endorsed by a vote of 6,000, and that's exactly the number of people Mogens has worked out could fit onto the crowded Pnyx.
But it's impossible to count 6,000 hands.
Mogens went to the cantons of Switzerland, where they guesstimate the vote.
First, I took photos, and then I blew up my photos. And with a pencil, I dotted each hand, so I could check that this was a fair method of deciding a majority in a large assembly.
You think this is a fair way of doing it?
Yes, it is. Aristotle shows that they did the same in Athens.
Just think of the hubbub of the assembly. 6,000 men here together. Shoemakers sitting next to nobles, and all debating issues which directly affected their lives. Heralds kept order, and there was a police force of slaves nearby if things got out of hand. But we're told that if the crowd really disliked one man's argument, they would shout him down until the roar reached to the skies.
So seriously did Athenians take being a player in democracy that they called people who didn't participate idiotes, which gives us our word, idiot.
Athenians actually had a word for politicians, and it was orator. People who were specially practiced and skilled in addressing large crowds. So you can get one orator to stand up against another, and in that way the people can choose. It's very important that you always have more than one voice.